Mr. Usher, continue when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Doctor. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
I think when we left off, was having you kind of walk through some of the opinions contained in Dr. Clark's postmortem report. That seem right?
Okay,
All right, I'm going to get back to you.
okay.
Look for permission. Is that the document we were talking about, Doctor?
Thank you, yes.
Okay. And one of the opinions by Dr. Clark was that the placement of the spit mask over the mouth is a significant factor, and I think he says, and possibly the most important factor. Do you remember him writing that or finding that?
Yes,
And I think on direct examination, you were talking about aspiration and locating blood and food substance in the airway of Mr. Ellis. Is that right?
yes,
Consistent with Mr. Ellis, well, consistent with a couple of things, right? One, either as a result of resuscitation, right?
no, I didn't say that he was resuscitated to receive aspiration.
Well, maybe I said that wrong. There's a couple of ways that the blood could have gotten into the airway. Is that right?
You have to hear the couple ways that you're describing before I would answer the question.
Sure. One is resuscitated efforts, and that is something you're saying that is not how it got in this case. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that the resuscitation put food and blood in the airway.
All right. And so the application of the spit could account for that blood going back in, breathing that blood back in after application. Is that fair?
Yeah, so the spit hood acts as a barrier for the blood and mucus to be completely expelled and away from the mouth, and it puts an individual at risk for aspiration, yes.
And if that's how it occurred for Mr. Ellis, he's actually breathing that back into his lungs from failure to get it out because of the spit. Is that right?
That is correct.
All right. So he's still breathing at the time.
Yes, he would be still breathing to aspirate.
Okay. And I think, if I remember this morning, you don't have any information about how long that spit hood was actually applied or in the position that would restrict the expelling of that material, right?
That is correct.
One of the other opinions that Dr. Clark had was that it was unlikely that this death would have occurred due to physical restraints alone. Is that right?
That's what Dr. Clark said, yes.
And it sounded like you agreed somewhat with that this morning. Do you agree with that opinion?
I'm suggesting that the physical restraint is the proximate cause of death.
So you disagree with that opinion of Dr. Clark's?
So, yes,
All right. And Dr. Clark further opined that an argument can be made that the extremely high methamphetamine concentration should be considered the primary factor in Mr. Ellis's death.
yes, Dr. Clark suggested the methamphetamine level.
All right. And you disagree with that opinion, at least from what I can tell from your testimony this morning?
Yes,
All right. All right. Are you aware that Dr. Clark made a presentation to the Attorney General's office outlining his findings in this case?
I was privy to a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if that PowerPoint presentation was the presentation that he gave, but I've seen a PowerPoint presentation.
All right. A PowerPoint presentation that Dr. Clark prepared in relation to this case, right?
That is correct.
All right. For information, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Defendant 2650. Okay, move around, Judge.
Proceed.
Dr. I'm going to hand you 2650. Is that what you reviewed?
Yes,
All right, and that has the case number on this case, Mr. Ellis's case on the very front, is that right?
yes.
All right. When do you recall seeing that?
It was part of some of my original materials.
Okay. And you see some, you call them bait stamps numbers in the lower right-hand corner of the exhibit?
Yes, I do.
All right. Can you turn to page stamp WAAG 0000483, please? Sorry, 483.
Yes.
Okay. And in Dr. Clark's PowerPoint presentation, at the bottom point there, he states further there is some value to the homicide classification towards reducing the public perception that a cover-up is being perpetrated by the death investigation agency, right?
I see that.
Do you agree with that?
No. I don't think the term homicide should be used to suggest that there's not a cover-up. If it's a homicide, it should be called a homicide. If it's not, it shouldn't be.
But that was part of the presentation that you understand that Dr. Clark provided in this case?
As it stands, yes.
All right. On the very next page, 484, I think is the number. Dr. Clark discusses the effects of methamphetamine. I think you have touched on this a little bit, but one of those is a mood changes ranging from euphoria to psychosis. Do you agree with that?
Yes, methamphetamine can cause that.
When we say psychosis, what do you mean psychosis? What does that mean?
Well, psychosis is essentially a medical term from detached from reality. A lot of the times when individuals identified as psychotic, they're hearing voices, or there may be other external factors that they may be hearing instructions from those external factors. That's usually what psychosis means.
And you reviewed some of the counseling records associated with Mr. Ellis's case, right?
Yes.
So you're aware that Mr. Ellis has indicated that when he uses meth, it makes him, or the effect is that he enters into a methamphetamine-induced psychosis.
I'm aware that Mr. Ellis suggested that he has psychosis when he is on methamphetamine.
And he used that as an explanation for the incident that occurred in September of 2019. Do you understand that?
Yes, there was an incident where he suggested that psychosis was reason for particular behavior.
All right. And that behavior was consistent with the behavior that's been described by the police in this instance, isn't it?
Yes.
One of the other effects of acute effects is violent behavior. Do you agree with that? Of methamphetamine?
Methamphetamine has been known to cause individuals to act violently, yes.
And cause death as well. Is that right?
Methamphetamine has been known to cause death? Is that the question? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
If you could turn to page 46 of that PowerPoint presentation. And 46 is dealing with the dilated cardiomyopathy, is it not?
Yes.
And in the presentation, Dr. Clark reports that the enlarged heart in this case would be considered the cause of death absent other causes. You see that?
Yes, I see that.
I can have you look at page 491 at the bottom of that same exhibit. Find that, Doctor?
Yes, I have it.
All right, and there's a bullet point there that says subjective findings are opinion, right?
So, yes, I see that.
And you agree that subjective findings are an opinion as it relates to medical examiner's determination of manner or cause, right?
I'm sorry, so can you ask that question again? I apologize.
Right. So we're looking at something Dr. Clark prepared, right?
Yes.
And he's indicated that subjective findings are opinion as it relates to your role as a medical examiner. Do you understand what he's saying there?
And for the record, I'm reading, there's additional bullets underneath.
Yeah, we're gonna get to those. I just wanna make sure before we get to those, the context. Does that make sense?
There are opinions that can be objective opinions. So I don't agree with the statement subjective findings are opinion. You can have objective findings that are opinion, and you can have subjective findings that are opinion.
So a medical examiner or a forensic pathologist can have both subjective and objective?
When establishing cause and manner of death, all opinions for the forensic pathologist should be objective, must be objective.
Okay. So then how does it, or when does it become subjective?
I don't know if I know the answer to that.
Okay, that's fair. But Dr. Clark, at least in the next bullet point that you just were reading to yourself, as I was asking the question, indicates a group of forensic pathologists would probably have differing ideas about how to interpret the objective and historical findings to produce an opinion for death certificate in this case, right?
Well, he doesn't say in this case in the actual text.
Oh, okay.
He says what you said, but he doesn't add in this case. And I disagree with that. I think that a group of forensic pathologists that may disagree in the objective findings of a case can still be objective in their opinion. That doesn't have to be subjective.
Okay. So you disagree with that kind of characterization by Dr. Clark?
Yeah, I disagree that a difference of opinion would somehow be subjective versus objective.
You would agree that depending on the forensic pathologist, they could interpret the findings in this case very differently, right?
I agree that there has been forensic pathologists that have interpreted the findings differently.
Consistent with that statement that Dr. Clark indicated there, right?
Yes, absent it being subjective.
And you disagree with that?
Yes.
All right. Okay. I think this morning, and maybe a little bit on Thursday, you were discussing hypoxia and that can be caused by a variety of things. Is that fair?
Yes.
All right. And really what that means is a lack of oxygen to the tissue from respiration.
That is correct.
And that happens, well, does that happen anytime the heart stops?
Yes, hypoxia would occur once the heart stops.
And that's because the blood is actually producing oxygen to different parts of the body as it's being pumped by the heart. Is that fair?
Blood is delivered by the heart to all tissues. So if the heart stops, then the blood that contains oxygen won't reach tissue.
All right, causing hypoxia.
It can cause hypoxia, yes.
So is it fair to say that hypoxia occurs over a period of time, or at least death from that?
Yes, it can happen immediately, depending on the mechanism, but it can happen absolutely over time.
For instance, if blood flow is restrained for long enough, you could die from hypoxia because it's not delivering oxygen where it needs to go.
That is correct.
Okay. How long would that take, approximately, if that were the mechanism?
If the heart stopped, how long would it take for someone to die from hypoxia?
Well, let's start there. So if it stopped altogether, how long do you live before you need some sort of resuscitation to get oxygen flowing again?
You need immediate resuscitation. That's a cardiac arrest. Someone can't live past a minute without circulating blood.
All right, so 60 seconds.
Yeah, less, yeah.
Okay. Now, if the heart is slowing down and not doing what it's supposed to do, can that cause hypoxia over time?
Yes.
How long, I know it's probably not an answer to this, but how long would that take if it's not beating normal?
I don't know.
Okay. Longer, I suspect you agree.
It can take longer.
Okay, minutes maybe?
Yes.
And if the blood flow is increased, an individual can actually recover and not die from hypoxia in that hypothetical circumstance. Is that fair?
Yes, yes, if you return blood flow back to normal and the reasons why someone's suffering from hypoxia is because of blood flow, then that is resuscitation.
Okay. And are you a UFC fan?
I am.
MMA, mixed martial arts?
All combat sports.
Okay. And so an example of what I'm describing, we see sometimes on the UFC fights on Saturday night, right? You agree with that?
I don't know what example you're talking about.
Well, I'll be clear. So for instance, if somebody administers a rear naked chokehold or a guillotine, those are chokeholds that restrict blood flow to the brain, right?
Yes,
And if that blood flow is restricted for a period of time, the fighter will lose consciousness, is that right?
that is correct.
And once that hold is removed, blood flow then begins at some point again after the application, right?
That is correct.
And once that blood flow begins again, that fighter will regain consciousness if they lose it. There?
That is right.
All right. So in that circumstance, once the blood flow is regains the normal, I guess, pressure by the heart, the individual will recover generally. Is that fair?
For the MMA fighter, yes.
And in those circumstances, that the choke, we'll call it chokehold, for lack of better, you want to call it something else?
Chokeholds are different than lateral carotid holds.
Okay. Well,
So you tell me what you're asking.
well, let's use the LVNR. You know what an LVNR is, right?
That's the lateral carotid hold.
Right. That's the lateral vascular neck restraint, right?
That's right.
The application of that hold is the crux of the arm up against the carotid arteries, correct?
It would be the bicep and the forearms against the jugulars and carotid arteries, yes.
And then the arm is brought back behind and there's application pushing down on the head to restrict that blood flow to the brain, right?
As we understand it.
Okay. When that's applied, the individual who has that being applied can still breathe, right?
Yes, they can still breathe.
It's the lack of blood flow to the brain that causes them to lose consciousness, right?
That is correct.
Okay. And if that hold is not applied correctly, it can cause injury to the neck. Is that fair?
Yes,
For instance, if instead of the bicep and the forearm being applied to the portions of the neck that have the major arteries, and it's the forearm, a straight application, that can cause injury to the throat, right?
that's right.
To the larynx,
Yes,
to the surrounding veins that are in that same area,
to the soft tissue, yes.
and the muscular, the muscles adjoining those, right?
Yes,
All right. In this case, there were no injuries to Mr. Ellis at all in that area, were there?
no, there were no evidence of neck injury.
Right. And you had indicated to the jury earlier you saw video evidence of some sort of neck restraint that caused him to lose consciousness. You remember saying that this morning?
Yes,
Was that the LVNR?
that's what I saw as the LVNR, yes.
All right. So you're talking about the Cowden video shot facing the officers as Mr. Ellis is being attempted to be restrained. Is that fair?
Yes,
And in that video, you can see Officer Collins' hand in front of the chest and neck of Mr. Ellis, right?
yes,
And you see his other left hand join his right hand on the left upper shoulder of Mr. Ellis. Is that fair?
I don't have a distinct memory of where hands were, but I'm tracking.
Okay. They've seen the video. Okay.
Yes,
That's the portion of the video you're talking about.
yes,
All right. You'd agree that in that video, it would have been the straight forearm of Mr. Collins that would have been up against the neck of Mr. Ellis. Is that right?
no, when I saw it, I saw the officer, and again, I don't know names. So an officer behind Mr. Ellis, and Mr. Ellis touch the arm, throw his arms back, touch the arms again. I saw movement and then I saw Mr. Ellis lose consciousness. That officer then had a moment to be able to reposition behind Mr. Ellis. That's the video scenario that I see as the lateral neck hold being placed and Mr. Ellis succumbing to that lateral neck hold.
Okay, we're talking about the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, did you watch that video on the timeline created by Grant Fredericks that introduces other data on a timeline? Does that make sense?
I had access to timed data along with the video. I don't remember who created it off the top of my head.
That's fair. So then you know that what you described as the officer behind having his hands in front of Mr. Ellis and then Mr. Ellis putting his hands up like this was in response to the other officer displaying the taser. Is that right?
I believe the taser was happening in that same time frame, yes.
Right, and the taser application is for 5 seconds, right?
Yes.
And then the time that Mr. Ellis goes limp is immediately following the 5-second application. You agree?
That would coincide with it.
Right. And you'd agree that the taser application, after administering that 5-second jolt of electricity, the purpose is to cause the person receiving it to lose the ability to resist at that point in time, right?
That's what I understand taser is involved in.
All right. And so what you described as Mr. Ellis succumbing to the lateral vascular neck restraint is actually him responding to the taser. You agree?
No, I mean, that's not how I saw the video. I saw the video with his arm, with the law enforcement's arms, where I described it, and am suggesting that he succumbed to the lateral neck hold.
As opposed to the taser?
As opposed to the taser in the moment that I'm discussing, yes.
Okay, so how did you determine which of those caused him to lose responsiveness?
Direct visualization.
From what you saw in the video?
That's correct.
Okay, understood. What the officer did immediately after Mr. Ellis, I think you said he wouldn't win, is that fair?
Yes.
What the officer behind immediately did is then move to Mr. Ellis's left hand and try to gain compliance of that left arm, right?
I believe there was movement to grab the arm as well as the knees being present on the back of the head and neck of Mr. Ellis.
Okay, you can actually see in that video, as that officer does that, the sweatshirt that Mr. Ellis is wearing underneath his knee, is that right?
I'm not sure exactly. I mean,
Underneath the officers.
Underneath the officer's knee. You're saying you're not sure, is that right?
the sweatshirt that he was wearing,
Yes.
if we were talking about the sweatshirt he was wearing underneath the knee that was on top of Mr. Ellis's back, then yes.
All right, and you understand that the back of that sweatshirt had a white, looked like Native American design on the back. Were you aware of that?
No.
Well, you could see the white design underneath the officer's knee in the time period that you're describing. Do you recall seeing that?
I did not make note of the insignia on the back of the sweatshirt.
You'd agree if you can see the insignia underneath the officer's knee, his knee is on the back as opposed to the head or neck.
Again, the video that I watched had one of the officers in that moment of transition with the knee and lower leg of the officer on the neck and upper back, neck, and head of Mr. Ellis.
Fair enough. All right. On Thursday, I think it was Thursday, Ms. Eakes put up a couple of photographs from either the scene or back at the coroner's office where you described the abrasions on both sides of his face. Do you remember talking about those?
Yes.
And your opinion to this jury was that that was because the officer was putting force down on Mr. Ellis's head onto the pavement. Do you remember saying that?
That was one of the ways he could get those brush abrasions, yes.
One of the other ways is Mr. Ellis smashing his own face into the cement once he was restrained. Do you agree with that?
That would be very forceful, complex, and he would be having to do it on both sides and rocking his face up against the concrete.
Possible, right?
It's possible.
When you reviewed the discovery in this case, did you review Washington State Patrol Officer K. Jones' report?
I don't remember exactly the report, but I can look at it.
I'm going to hand you what's been marked as plaintiff's 822.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have you seen that report before, Doctor?
I may have. There was thousands of pieces of paper.
Hundreds of thousands, right?
A lot.
Go ahead and review that, and then I'll ask you some questions based on your review of that.
Yes, I see it.
All right, and according to Officer or Trooper Jones, he appeared on scene at 23:27 hours. You see that documentation? Top of the second paragraph.
23:24. 23:24 hours, according to this report.
Well, that's when he was advised, but at the top of the second paragraph, it said that approximately 23:27, he actually arrived on scene, right?
23:27, he arrived on scene.
All right. And then the next paragraph, he describes, I observed a male lying on his stomach, detained in handcuffs. He was screaming and appeared to be striking the pavement with his head. I overheard several officers attempting to speak with and calm him. However, it did not appear to be working as he continued to scream and struggle, right?
I see that, yes.
And that could account for the abrasions that you've discussed relative to Mr. Ellis's face. You agree, right?
As I described, I mean, it's possible, but because of brush abrasions, there is a speed in which those brush abrasions are occurring. There are injuries on his face that could account for him banging his head up against the concrete. It wouldn't be my opinion that the brush abrasions on his cheeks would be those injuries.
So it would depend on the amount of force that you'd be doing that with in order to cause what you described. Is that fair?
Yeah, force and velocity.
Okay. And we don't have any indication of the amount of force or velocity that he was doing this with?
No, not for the throwing of the head. He does have contusions on his forehead, and as I described in last week's testimony, blunt force trauma is blunt force trauma, and whether they were strikes, those contusions on the forehead, or whether they were him hitting his head up against the concrete, I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Fair enough. I want to talk about blunt force trauma. I'm glad you brought that up. Can we get Exhibit 255 published, please? All right. Doctor, can you see that on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, and on Thursday, you described for the jury many of the injuries that we see depicted in Mr. Ellis's left hand. Do you remember doing that?
Yes.
Ms. Eakes asked you specifically about the abrasions below the cuff marks on the wrist. You see those there?
Yes.
And some, I think you described it as maybe gravel marks or from gravel type material as some points around the handcuff area. Do you see those?
Yes.
What she didn't ask you to describe was his knuckle on his pointer finger. Remember that?
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, that's from blunt force trauma, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
That's different than friction on pavement, right?
It could still be friction on pavement. There's a bit of a laceration. I can come down and show you the laceration.
Because that's what I was just going to ask you.
Yeah.
There's a difference between a laceration and a friction injury, correct?
Yeah. So, again, for the record, looking at Exhibit 255, in case number 200519, there's an abrasion here. We spoke a lot about this last week, this abrasion, this brush abrasion here, this tram track abrasion, some of the gravel, what I think is gravel abrasion here. Here is probably a better, last week we saw one that had some blood on it. This one is a little bit cleaner. There's still multiple areas that could be gravel abrasions. And then this one here is, a tearing of the skin, a laceration. That could be gravel as well, but it's blunt force trauma. It's coming in contact with a blunt surface.
For instance, if Mr. Ellis was punching the window of a patrol vehicle with his left hand, that sort of laceration could result, right?
Depends on how hard he's hitting it.
And how many times he hit it.
Definitely how hard he's hitting it. The context that it has the small pinpoint gravel abrasions near it. So you take that into context, but it's a blunt injury. So what he's hitting or what he's falling on or it's against, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly.
Fair enough. You are aware that Officer Burbank is seated in one of the officers seated in the passenger compartment of the patrol vehicle alleges that Mr. Ellis is punching the window repeatedly. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And that injury would be consistent with that sort of striking against the window, wouldn't it?
That one injury could be caused by it.
All right. We see 256, please. And we see that from a different angle there, Doctor. You see what I'm showing you?
Yeah,
All right.
I do see it.
Same laceration, right?
Same laceration.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Pritchard touched on a little bit. You can actually do some testing, forensic testing on the brain to determine how much hypoxia contributed to a death, can't you?
You can bring in a neuropathologist to take a look at the brain and look at under the microscope particular areas to see whether or not there was evidence of hypoxia.
Okay. And
Yeah.
I'll touch on that in a second. You would agree, doctor, that if an individual is able to speak, then death is not imminent from brain injury. You agree with that?
Not from brain injury. That's not, it depends on when in the continuum that person is speaking and when in the time frame of that individual being suffering from hypoxia, where they are on that. They can speak until that hypoxia has now come to a place where they can't. So it depends on when you reach that person.
Well, would you agree that the ability to speak evidences the highest level of brain functionality?
I wouldn't say that. I don't think I would be able to say that.
Outside your area of expertise?
Yeah, highest level of brain functionality on hypoxia, I wouldn't be able to tell
Fair
you.
enough, fair enough. Well, there are tests that can be done on the brain to determine the damage or the result of the hypoxia to the brain, right?
Well, there's what we call an EEG. I mean, you can measure the electrical impulses that is happening to the brain. I mean, that's not happening here. And then post-mortem, you can look under the microscope to see what areas of the brain that may be most affected by the decrease in oxygen.
And I'm going to keep focused on your area of expertise post-mortem, right?
Sure.
You can take samples of the hippocampus to determine the effect of failure of oxygen to the brain.
The hippocampus is the first place where hypoxia is going to show itself in the brain.
Right. And if you had done an autopsy on taken samples of the hippocampus, right?
Yes.
Because you would want to know what effect the hypoxia had on his brain, right?
Yes,
That wasn't done in this case, was it?
it wasn't.
And so there's no forensic ability to determine resulting hypoxia on hippocampus or any other part of the brain in this case, is there?
That's correct.
All right, doctor, I mentioned excited delirium before the lunch break, and I think you want to talk about that a little more, right?
Only if you want to.
Oh, I do. Okay.
Okay.
You had indicated that excited delirium is generally associated with police in custody deaths, or at least the allegation of that symptomology. Is that fair?
Yes.
Well, you would agree, doctor, that generally the folks that are coming into contact with people who are suffering from mental health and drug usage that manifest excited delirium are law enforcement officers, right?
I don't know, because excited delirium has been suggested to not be a diagnosis that's recognized. So
So we're gonna get there, but just the symptomology associated with that reference, you would agree that generally it's law enforcement officers that are dealing with folks that are suffering from mental health and drug usage where that comes into play and is reported adjacent to a death, right?
yes, I could suggest that law enforcement comes into contact with individuals that have mental health issues.
And are using methamphetamine and other drugs that exacerbate those mental health issues?
I don't know in general, but I would say yes, that law enforcement comes into contact with individuals that have mental health issues and drug substance abuse issues.
And when people die in those circumstances, it's generally in law enforcement custody, right?
Not everyone dies from substance use and abuse and mental health issues that come into contact with law enforcement.
No, I'm talking generally, when we're talking about excited delirium. The context in which that is claimed to have been a cause or contributing factor in death is generally relative to law enforcement action with an individual suffering from the things we've been talking about, right?
Yes, that is where we most see the diagnosis of excited delirium as a cause of death with interactions with law enforcement, yes.
Okay. And I think, if I understand, at least from our previous discussions, you don't think that's a diagnosis. That's not an accepted diagnosis in your field, right?
That's correct. It's not a diagnosis that causes death.
Right. It's more of a constellation of symptomology. Would you agree with that?
That's correct.
Meaning that the term excited delirium is generally associated with people who are suffering from some mental health situation. Is that fair?
I think the excited delirium diagnosis has been tagged with individuals that are suffering from mental health or substance use and abuse issues.
Yeah, usually in combination, the mental health in combination with some sort of stimulant, whether it's methamphetamine or cocaine or some other narcotic, right?
That is how excited delirium has been used, yes.
Well, in excited delirium cases, there's no anatomy of death because the person just dies suddenly in that context. Would you agree with that?
The cases that have been attributed to excited delirium are cases that often have other restraint-related issues that have been not diagnosed as restraint-related issues, but have been diagnosed as excited delirium, as some sudden cardiac death. The literature now and associations now and medicine now realizes that excited delirium in and of itself, this notion of excited delirium, is not a diagnosis and does not cause death.
Right. But the symptomology is still present and accounts for in-custody deaths, just not labeled as excited delirium. Is that fair?
No, I think the use of the term excited delirium is a is no longer accepted even in description of the symptomology. It's never been part of the American Psychiatric's diagnostic manual. It is, there are symptoms of agitation, symptoms of psychosis that should be described as such. And then the cause of death would be something different and apart from the agitation and the psychosis. And that's where medicine is today.
Yeah, we're gonna get there in a second, but additional symptomology is aggression in those circumstances, do you agree?
In what circumstances?
Where it was previously categorized as excited delirium causing death.
Yes, previously diagnosed as excited delirium cause of death, that symptomology would suggest that someone was aggressive.
Including psychosis, right?
Yes,
In fact, you authored a paper, co-authored a paper, named position paper. Remember, we talked about that a little bit earlier?
yes,
Didn't you write, or as part of that, indicate the more difficult cases are those where individual is observed to be acting erratically due to severe mental illness and/or acute drug intoxication?
yes,
You go on to say these cases have been defined in the literature as excited delirium and often result in a law enforcement response and restraint of a decedent.
yes.
That's you, right?
Well, I was part of that paper, yes.
And then you also indicate it is not uncommon for the individual to die during or soon after restraint and/or altercation with law enforcement.
That's correct.
Manner of death in these instances can often be inconsistent from pathologist to pathologist and from office to office.
That is correct.
You go on to write, furthermore, manners of death in these cases have included accident due to the emphasis placed on drug toxicity, homicide due to the influence of restraint and/or altercation, or undetermined due to the inability of the certifying physician to establish a definitive opinion.
Yes,
And then you go on to recommend. There's a recommendation after that accounting, right? Where you, or the group committee recommends that physicians consider homicide as the manner of death in cases similar to those that would otherwise meet the threshold of deaths at the hand of another.
yes,
Doctor, you've seen the toxicology report in this case, have you not?
I have.
And I'm gonna show you what's been marked as premises 266 with course permission.
Proceed.
266. That's the toxicology from NMS Laboratories as it relates to the post-mortem examination on Mr. Ellis. Is that fair?
Yes,
And in the toxicology report, it indicates the specific numbers relative to what was found in his blood, right?
yes,
And we talked about the 2,400 nanograms per milliliter of methamphetamine,
yes,
and also 54 nanograms per milliliter of amphetamine.
yes.
What's the difference?
Well, amphetamine is a known breakdown product of methamphetamine. About 5 to 7% of methamphetamine will be broken down by the liver into amphetamine. The majority of methamphetamine is excreted from the body as methamphetamine. So the presence of amphetamine in someone who has a higher dose of methamphetamine can be seen as its breakdown product, another term is called metabolism of the drug. The other way you can have amphetamine in it is if the methamphetamine is not pure methamphetamine, because when it's being made, no one knows. There could be a portion of that methamphetamine and portion of that drug that also has pure amphetamine in it, and it's not a breakdown product. So it depends on, what drug is being ingested.
And what that suggests, at least relative to Mr. Ellis, is that he consumed the methamphetamine relatively soon in time to the time of his death. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. The methamphetamine is 2.4 milligrams per liter, and the amphetamine is like 0.054. So the amphetamine, if we believe the amphetamine is a breakdown product of the methamphetamine, then he would have taken the methamphetamine relatively recently. The other caveat is that chronic users will keep methamphetamine in their system a little bit longer. Also, because the liver is what breaks down methamphetamine, some are rapid metabolizers, some are non-rapid metabolizers of drugs. So we don't know that. I don't know that about Mr. Ellis. So there are particular caveats to it, but at its base, it looks like that's a recent consumption of the methamphetamine.
And doctor, you talked about tolerance relative to folks that use meth regularly. If somebody abstains for a 3-month period, you wouldn't expect to see any of the metabolite in their system at that point in time. It was tested 3 months ago, right?
Whether they abstain or not, you wouldn't see the metabolite. Whether they were an active user, you shouldn't see the metabolite. The metabolite is only going to be there if they had a recent use, like what is being suggested here.
And Exhibit 266 also has a key on, I think it's the second or third page, that tells the reader the effects of certain levels of methamphetamine on a user. You see that there?
I see it.
And what it says is that blood levels between 200 and 600 nanograms per milliliter, those individuals often exhibit violent behavior. Is that right?
Yes, to read it explicitly, again, this is the NMS lab report. It says blood levels 200 to 600 nanograms per milliliter have been reported in methamphetamine abusers who exhibited violent and irrational behavior.
And Mr. Ellis was, what, 12 to 4 times that level?
2,400 is the nanograms per milliliter is what he had in his system.
Right, so 12 times more than 200 nanograms per liter, right?
Yes, again, that's the math equations. So I'll let you do the math.
600 is 4 times, I'm sorry, Mr. Ellis is 4 times the high end of the range that's indicated there of 600 nanograms per milliliter, right?
4 times 6 is 24.
And it also indicates that folks in that range exhibit irrational behavior. Do you agree with that?
As it reads.
Yeah. Is that consistent with your understanding? Is that consistent with your understanding of the effects of methamphetamine on individuals?
Yes.
Thank you, Judge. That's all I have.
Mr. Conrad?
Good afternoon. I do not have my report, just Dr. Clark's report.
Figure out when you first got involved with this case. So my understanding is that you were first hired in November of 2021. Is that consistent with your understanding?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And this is an incident that occurred March 3rd, 2020.
Yes.
Okay. And we have that our client, Officer Rankine, was charged May 2021.
Okay, yes. I don't know, I don't remember exactly when he was charged. I apologize.
Your first involvement in this case came after a charging decision had already been made.
Apparently so, yes.
Okay. And then, as you've already testified to, you're aware that Dr. Clark is the individual, the doctor that did the initial autopsy in this case.
Yes,
And presumably, Dr. Clark is licensed to practice medicine in Washington, right?
I don't know where Dr. Clark is licensed to practice medicine.
Well, if he did the autopsy that took place here in Pierce County, is it safe to assume that he's licensed to practice medicine in Washington?
You're asking to make an assumption. It may be a reasonable one, but you're asking to make an assumption.
Well, you're not licensed to practice medicine in Washington.
I am not.
Okay. And you've never been hired by any county in the state of Washington to perform an autopsy. Is that fair?
That is fair.
Okay. And obviously, we're not present for the autopsy here, but you were first contacted by the Attorney General's office in order to provide an additional opinion in this matter?
Yes,
Okay. And you don't have any reason to believe that Dr. Clark did not complete a full autopsy in this matter, right?
that is correct.
I mean, Dr. Clark's been doing this for over 39 years. Are you aware of that?
I don't know exactly when he started his career, but
And when you're conducting an autopsy, you'd agree that it's critical that you provide a comprehensive and detailed autopsy report when you first publish your findings, right?
yes,
And that's standard practice to include all the relevant factors in making your determination.
in an autopsy report that would be mostly biological and anatomical, yes.
Okay. And, I mean, it's essential that when you do that first autopsy report, it shows transparency and leads the reader through what your logical determination is, right?
Yes, for an autopsy report, you want to state the findings that you found at autopsy and establish your cause and manner of death. In some jurisdictions, it includes an opinion. In other jurisdictions, it doesn't. It depends upon the jurisdiction of that where that autopsy report is found.
Right, and because a detailed autopsy report is crucial for other experts to rely upon, like you,
Yes,
investigators, legal professionals, and help them make informed decisions, correct?
that is correct.
Okay. And you'd agree that there's nothing incomplete or vague about Dr. Clark's initial autopsy report in this case, right?
As we described before, there are some things that I would have liked to see more of in the autopsy report, but nothing that would stop another medical examiner from reviewing it and coming to a similar opinion.
Okay. And in that autopsy report, the initial autopsy report done by Dr. Clark, he noted there's no anatomical finding for cause of death, right?
Yes,
Okay. So he can't point to any one thing within his autopsy that says, aha, that's what killed him, right?
that is correct.
Okay. And so, and that makes this case particularly complex, right?
That is correct.
Because you can't just point to one thing that says, aha, that's what killed him. You have to look at the circumstances and all the additional factors, right?
That is correct.
So that's what you were hired to do, is to undertake that process and look at these additional factors as well. Am I understanding correct?
Yes,
Okay. So, and you'd agree, again, this is a case that's extremely complex.
yes,
And in Dr. Clark's initial autopsy report, he doesn't make any mention of any aspiration of blood or food particles that are present within the lung, correct?
I believe he does identify blood and food in the lungs. I believe his histology sections describe that.
Okay.
Yes. I have Dr. Clark's original.
250?
I do.
Okay. And if you look at the first page of Exhibit 250, in the opinion section, you agree with me that in that opinion section, he's laying out what his understanding of the circumstances surrounding Mr. Ellis's death are,
Yes, he is.
and then he's going through what the autopsy examination shows in terms of external injuries as well as internal findings related to Mr. Ellis as well.
Yes.
And he indicates that, again, the methamphetamine concentration is well within the fatal range, could have caused this death independently.
Yes, he does.
And he says that if it did, he would expect that a cardiac dysarrhythmia, such as ventricular fibrillation, would produce sudden death.
Yes.
He goes on to say that it's more likely that it's progressive hypoxia as a result of physical restraint and positioning and placement of the mask over the mouth. Yes. And he also goes on to state that it's certified as due to hypoxia as a result of physical restraint with the contributing condition of methamphetamine intoxication and a dilated heart.
Yes.
He also said it's unlikely that this death would have occurred due to physical restraint alone without the contributing conditions.
That's what he says.
But nowhere in there does he indicate that there is any food particles or blood that Mr. Ellis aspirated that would have caused hypoxia.
Not in that paragraph, no.
Is there an additional paragraph where he lays out his opinion regarding food particles and blood?
No, he merely describes it in his microscopic sections, particularly on page 5 of it. He says, sections of the lung show edema and focal intraalveolar hemorrhage. I was able to see food particles on my review of the material.
But he doesn't indicate that within his microscopic examination.
His microscopic examination finding says sections of lung show edema and focal intraalveolar hemorrhage. That's blood in the airway.
Okay. But you'd agree with me that the blood in the airway versus blood in the lungs are two separate things, right?
They're not, he says intraalveolar hemorrhage. So intraalveolar hemorrhage, the alveoli are the terminal part of the lungs. That's what you see under the microscope. It's the sacs where air is exchanged, oxygen and carbon dioxide. He describes, and I saw as well, consistent with him, that there is blood in the alveoli, which is part of the airway.
And it's your belief that blood in that region is a result of aspiration of the blood?
Yes.
Okay. And you don't know how much blood was in the airway?
Right, because the sections, we take very small sections to get examples of the airway. So when we see it in one area, it is likely that it is throughout the airway, throughout the lung.
Okay. But you don't know in terms of volume how much blood was in his airway?
That's correct.
And you don't know in terms of volume how much food was in Mr. Ellis's airway?
That is correct.
Okay. And would you agree with me that blood in the airway, it can also be a result of resuscitation?
There could be blood in the airway if someone is being resuscitated, yes.
Okay. And how about food?
Less likely food, but you can see food in the airway.
Okay. So, I want to jump back to your report. And in your report, you list enough, well, if I can show you your report, it's marked as Exhibit 479. Can I approach, Your Honor?
Yep.
Showing the witness, it's been marked as Exhibit 479.
Thank you.
And that's a copy of the report.
Yes, it is a copy of my report.
So on that first page of your report, you list the materials that you reviewed as of the date of the writing of your report, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And you previously talked about the importance of medical records in your field of work as well, right?
Yes,
And it gives you kind of a roadmap for where the decedent, where they've come from, what their medical history is, right?
yes,
Like you wouldn't just go to a new general practitioner and that general practitioner would just blindly talk to you about some of the issues. They'd ask for some of your medical records as well. Is that fair?
that's fair.
Okay. And so, it gives you this valuable insight into the overall health and pre-existing conditions that might be relevant to your determination of the case, right?
Yes,
But the list of materials that you reviewed and the date of your report is July 14th, 2022, correct?
yes,
But the list of materials that you reviewed, nowhere within that list are any of Mr. Ellis's medical records, right?
that's correct.
Okay. You didn't obtain those medical records actually until after you had already written your report, right?
Your Honor, I'm gonna object that that mistakes the document.
He said, ask him about the documents, ask him about what he did.
Right, but
Overruled.
he said that it doesn't contain any of the records. It mistakes the document.
He's asked a question which would answer this. Let him answer the question. Objections is overruled.
Okay. Well, so just back to what Ms. Eeks is talking about. So there's this Pierce County Alliance General Notes Summary. That is contained within the materials review, right?
Yes,
Okay, so his mental health records, some of that you reviewed.
yes, and again, as described in the cross on the other attorneys, his background as it relates to his mental health background, the pericarditis, all of these things were within these records as well. So I didn't get the extensive several thousand page from 2015 records prior to this diagnosis, as I think you're asking me.
Well, so those prior diagnoses that you're talking about, they're mentioned in some of the records, right?
That is correct.
Okay, but it doesn't actually detail what's going on. It just says he's previously had those diagnoses, right?
That is correct.
So you're not seeing the actual medical records, maybe ER visits where he's come in to Tacoma General complaining of chest pain or breathing or something like that, right?
That's correct.
You hadn't seen any of those records at the time that you drafted your report, July 2022.
That's correct.
Okay. And it wasn't until after you drafted your report that you were provided those materials, right?
That is correct.
And in fact, we did a defense interview of you in November, I believe, of 2020, 2022. And at that point, you had just received the medical records.
That's correct.
And you were still in the process of reviewing some of those medical records at the time that we were interviewing you.
That is right.
And in fact, those medical records never even came from the Attorney General's office, did they?
I'm not quite sure where if they, I was receiving all my records from the Attorney General's
Sure.
office.
Well, do you remember what, we just talked about Bates stamps a bit, and I think that your report may have a Bates stamp on there, right?
You can define bait stamp, I don't know what
Bates
that is.
stamp is kind of a page number, if you will, that signifies certain pages on a document. So like, your report has WAG 0053783, see that?
Yes,
And WAG, Washington Attorney General, right?
okay,
But all the medical records that you received after writing your report, the Bates stamp on those said Rankine Medical Expert. Did they not?
oh, I don't remember the bait stamp on the documents, I apologize.
Okay. Well, you don't have any reason to believe that the defense is not, are the individuals that went out and got those medical records and then provided them to the Attorney General's office, who then provided them to you, correct?
I have no reason to disbelieve that.
Okay. Is there any reason, do you know why the Attorney General's office never went out and looked at any of Mr. Ellis's medical records before hiring you?
I don't know.
Mr. Ellis he was 33 years old at the time of his death, correct?
He was.
And is it fair to say that Mr. Ellis was not the healthiest of individuals?
That's fair to say. He had health issues for sure.
Okay. Among some of the health issues that he had is this dilated heart, right?
Yes,
And it weighed 480 grams.
yes,
And that is not a normal heart size for an individual of his stature and of his age, right?
that is correct.
And he also has a long history of severe drug abuse as well, right?
Yes, he does.
And you have seen in your profession many times where an individual has a long history of drug abuse that then leads to a dilated heart like Mr. Ellis had, right?
I've seen it.
Now I want to talk about the importance of some of those things to your finding as well, because ultimately it's your determination that you made prior to receiving any of the medical records that the cause of death here was mechanical asphyxia, correct?
Yes,
And that's, you talk about hypoxia, right?
as one of the mechanisms, yes.
And this idea of hypoxia is that there's a lack of oxygen circulation within the system, right?
That is correct.
Okay. But there's not anything that you can actually point to within the autopsy to say, aha, hypoxia, right?
Yes, and my report doesn't hang my hat on hypoxia, but you're right.
Okay. But hypoxia is the end result, I guess, of someone having asphyxia, right?
Both hypoxia, and particularly mechanical asphyxia, hypoxia, acidosis, and cardiac output can also play a role.
Okay. But there's nothing that you can really specifically point to that proves that Mr. Ellis had hypoxia during this event, right?
We have findings that, based upon symptomology, we talked a little bit about EMS, the EMS report that supports hypoxia, but I don't have a tissue diagnosis of hypoxia, no.
Okay. Like, if you had O2 readings throughout the time that this event was occurring, you would be able to look at those O2 readings and determine possibly whether there was an issue with hypoxia, right?
So O2 is oxygen, and yes, if somehow he had a pulse ox on his finger during the time frame, then we would know that definitively, well, not definitively, but measurably, that he was hypoxic.
Okay. So what you're doing is you're pointing to this issue of hypoxia and you're trying to look at circumstantial evidence to help support the opinion that he's hypoxic, right?
So the findings that we have of injuries that are consistent with him being in a prone position, history that he's in a prone position, physical findings that he is hobbled, and to be hobbled is to be in the prone position, as well as evidence of the spit hood placement, as well as aspiration, all is evidence of hypoxia, and the evidence of PEA, bradycardia and PEA, as well as him over time showing a movement towards shallow breathing, and then his response by EMS showing that he had a slowed heart rate and PEA all go along with the differential diagnosis or the medical diagnosis of hypoxia.
Okay. So again, you're looking at all these differing factors to put the pieces of the puzzle together to try and determine that it's consistent with your theory of hypoxia, right?
No, it's less the theory of hypoxia. The whole purpose of the forensic medicine is to determine cause and manner of death to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. And so all of the above is to understand what his cause and manner of death is. So we don't, as forensic pathologists, we shouldn't go into the case already trying to prove a theory. We need to go into a case trying to allow for what is objectively presented to us, to use all of our information to establish cause and manner of death.
Okay. Well, I mean, hypoxia can have multiple causes, right?
Yes.
So there's certain things that we can most definitely point to within this autopsy, like meth, for example, can cause hypoxia, right?
Meth is not causing hypoxia directly, no.
Okay, it's a good point. So, but meth can cause restriction of the blood vessels, right?
Meth does cause what they call vasoconstriction, yes.
Vasoconstriction, and that reduces blood flow, right? Or it can reduce blood flow.
So vasoconstriction increases blood pressure, doesn't really reduce blood flow, doesn't cause infarcts or lack of, per se, cause hypoxia. That's not really what methamphetamine does. Methamphetamine increases the contractility of the heart, causes increased heart rate, causes the heart to have to pump harder. That's really the effect, and that happens because of the constriction of vessels in the body, the smaller vessels in the body. So it's not causing hypoxia per se.
Sure, but ultimately that restriction, right, causing the heart to have to pump harder, and the restriction of the blood vessels, that can reduce blood flow.
Again, methamphetamine is when we talk about methamphetamine and its effects, methamphetamine's effects is not to reduce blood flow. It's not reducing blood flow.
Okay, but ultimately, methamphetamine can have an effect on the oxygenation of blood.
Methamphetamine's effect on the oxygenation of blood would be that the heart itself goes into a cardiac arrhythmia, and then the heart can't pump to the organs. As we understand the physiology of methamphetamine, it is not causing hypoxia to tissues. That is not how methamphetamine exhibits its euphoria or exhibits its lethal effect.
So, and I'm not talking about lethality, right? I'm talking about how meth, let's start then with the basic premise. Meth is not good for you, right?
No, well, methamphetamine itself is prescribed, but as it relates to substance use and abuse and how it's being used for substance use and abuse, no, it's not good. Chronic methamphetamine use or amphetamine use outside of the prescription of a physician is not good for you.
Okay. Well, do you know what the therapeutic level of methamphetamine is?
Methamphetamine in it of itself does not have a therapeutic level as we describe it.
Okay. So, and methamphetamine, you talked about a couple of different things of how methamphetamine affects the cardiac system, right?
Yes,
But we can agree that meth does have an effect on an individual's cardiac system, right?
absolutely.
And you're not a cardiologist, right?
I am not.
Okay. And you're not a toxicologist either, right?
I am not.
Okay. And would you agree with me also, you're not a pulmonologist either?
I'm not a pulmonologist.
So, do you know what meth's effect is on the respiratory system?
Vasoconstriction is the biggest effect on the respiratory system.
All right, well, we're getting somewhere. So, meth causes vasoconstriction, which then that can have an effect on the respiratory system, right?
It can have an effect on the respiratory system.
Okay, and it's affecting the respiratory system and inhibiting the ability to breathe, that can lead to hypoxia.
So as we understand methamphetamine is not causing direct hypoxia through the respiratory system. And it goes through the cardiovascular system to cause its effects.
Okay. So the cardiomyopathy that
We'll take our afternoon recess. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not discuss the case among yourselves or with anyone else. We'll hopefully be back in 15 minutes. Thank you.